to terror, fear, and anger, and frustration. Everything, it seems, except the thanksgiving. I've often wondered how it is Paul could compose such words as this, especially given that he wrote them from prison, and what was probably his last imprisonment, which led to his death. Rejoice, he says, almost as if the things of this life don't matter at all. It makes me wonder. I've thought in the past that perhaps what Paul was getting at may have been the same thing that John Wesley was getting at when he focused on Jesus' command to be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And when Wesley talked about that, he never claimed having achieved perfection in this life in love. But he always held it out there as the goal toward which he strove, toward which he believed every person of faith should be striving. I thought maybe that's what Paul was doing here when he said, rejoice in the Lord always. A recognition that we may not be there now, but it's the goal toward which we stretch. Perhaps. My own experience with depression and the hard work of climbing out of that deep, dark hole have taught me something else as well. I've learned that while we may not always feel like rejoicing, that while life can be so filled with pain and uncertainty that there appears to be no reason for which to give thanks, that really this is the deception of that dark hole of depression, the deception of our feelings. Because both the ability to rejoice and the ability to give thanks to God come as we begin to look upward and outward instead of inward. Depression is about looking inward. Thankfulness and rejoicing is about looking outward. When we become willing to look upward to God and outward to others, we discover that there are still blessings which enable us to rejoice and give thanks, even sometimes in the most horrific situations. I think, in fact, that it comes down to our own willingness to choose to be thankful, even joyful. In 1 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul again encourages us with these words. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. In her wonderful book, The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom relates an amazing story about the importance of being thankful. Corrie and her sister Betsy were interred in a concentration camp known as Ravensbrück. They lived in a barracks that were plagued by lice. Lice were everywhere, in their hair, on their bodies. And one day Betsy said to Corrie, we need to give thanks to God for the lice. Corrie said, Betsy, you've gone too far this time. There is no way I'm going to give thanks to God for the lice. Betsy said, but Corrie, the Bible tells us in everything give thanks. Still, Corrie admitted she did not want to give thanks to God for lice. But as it turns out, Corrie and Betsy were trying to reach the other women in their barracks with the message of the gospel. And they had begun to hold Bible studies in the barracks. Corey later found out that the guards stayed away from their barracks because of the lice. And because the guards would not go into the barracks, they were able to have their Bible studies uninterrupted. As a result, they led many women to the Lord and to faith. So perhaps God can use even lice for something good. Now, if the Bible had said, in some things give thanks, I would have no problem with that. But because it says in everything give thanks, because Paul says, rejoice, again I say rejoice, I have to acknowledge that that's not always an easy thing to do. But notice that it doesn't say to us that we should give thanks for everything, but rather give thanks in everything. And that's a significant difference. Because there are some things that happen that I will never be glad that they happened. There are some things that happen that I believe even God is not happy that they happen. Things that break our hearts and things that break God's heart again and again. But still God is present, and because God is with us, God is at work in the midst of our suffering. As Paul would write to the Romans, he said, we know that in all things God works for good, for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. When it comes to the question of the existence of evil and of suffering, we have to acknowledge that suffering does in fact come to everyone at some point. But when we choose to trust God, then we are trusting that God is at work even in the midst of that suffering. That somehow God will bring about redemption in the midst of that suffering. Now, it may not be good for us, but it may be that there is perhaps some lesson for the world that comes out of it. Author Donald Miller reminds us that our lives are basically stories, and that we must constantly be at the hard work of writing meaningful stories with our lives. Take, for example, the life story and the work of Dr. Viktor Frankl. Now, maybe you recognize his name as the author of that little book entitled Man's Search for Meaning. But you may not remember Frankl's story. Frankl was one who argued that the deepest desire of every human being is to experience a life of meaning. Now, Frankl was alive at the same time as Sigmund Freud. And Freud believed that man's greatest, deepest desire was to pursue pleasure. Frankl argued with Freud over that, saying that he believed that man's desire for a deep experience of meaning was really the core of who we are, and that in our failure to find that experience of meaning, we would then turn to an experience of pleasure, to distract ourselves from our frustration. This belief became the foundation of Frankl's work in the development of what has become known as logotherapy, a psychological therapy of meaning in which he basically posits that there are three things in your life that you have to have in order to have meaning. But that if these three categories are in order, then you will actually experience a deep sense of meaning in life. Frankl tested his theory in a couple of very hard places. One of those hard places were in the concentration camps of World War II. He, like millions of other Jews, were interred by the Germans in concentration camps. He spent time in 3 different camps, and he lost his mom, and his dad, and his brother, and his wife in those camps. He had a huge reason to be despondent. But he kept himself alive by writing on the top of his bunk notes that would later become the basis for his book. He knew that this book, if he were to live through this experience and could get it published, was important, and he was willing to take on and engage in the conflict so that if he lived, then maybe this book would get out there and it would help people. He survived the concentration camps. He came up as a pretty prominent psychologist in Vienna until they one day came to him and said, Dr. Frankel, we have a huge Viennese hospital system. We have about 30,000 patients in our various psychiatric divisions. Many of them are suicidal. In fact, we're losing a number of patients every year to suicide. It's a tragedy. And they asked him, if you were to take over the system, what would you do? He said, well, I'd put them through logotherapy. I'd teach them these 3 things. And he did. He put together small groups of patients, and he taught the patients his 3 things to focus on, to bring meaning to life. And under Viktor Frankl's watch, not a single person committed suicide. Now, without going into the details of his logotherapy, what he basically accomplished was to help patients find meaning in their lives, just as he had held on to a sharp focus of meaning for his life, even amid his own horrific circumstances and experiences. And more than this, not only are our lives basically stories that we need to be writing as co-creators with God, but we need to remember that every great story has both a hero and a villain. And again, Donald Miller points out to us that both heroes and villains have much in common. They have both had some form of great suffering. But he points out there's also one huge difference between them. You see, a hero looks at their suffering and looks for redemption, ways in which that suffering can bring meaning. But a villain is looking for vengeance for their suffering. Now, I would simply add to those 2 categories a third. I believe that there are not just heroes and villains, there are also victims. And we can choose to be a victim. A victim is one whose experience of suffering leads them not to redemption, nor even to the violence of vengeance, but simply to wallow in their suffering. They never move beyond it. A victim may not lash out like a villain, but neither do they allow their suffering to become transformative and redemptive. They do not allow God to be at work in them to bring about some good out of that, good for themselves or for others. We choose whether we will write a great life story. We choose whether we will be hero or villain or victim. We choose whether we will understand our suffering as redemptive. And it's in our choosing that we determine whether we will rejoice in the Lord always or whether we will give thanks in everything. Now, around the time that the Pilgrim Pilgrims landed in North America, there lived a pastor by the name of Martin Rinkart, who served a parish in the town of Eilenburg, Germany. Rinkart was a Lutheran minister who came to Eilenburg at the beginning of and lived through the 30 Years' War. The walled city of Eilenburg became the refuge for political and military fugitives, but the result was overcrowding. And with the overcrowding came pestilence and famine. Armies overran the city 3 different times. And the Rinkart home was a refuge for the victims, even though he was often hard-pressed to provide for his own family. During the height of the plague of 1637, more than 8,000 people died in Eilenburg. And Rinkart was the only pastor to survive. So he ended up conducting as many as 50 funerals a day and 4,000 funerals in that single year, including the funeral of his own wife. Now, just a year before, in 1636, Rinkart had written a table blessing that begins, "Now thank we all our God, with hearts and hands and voices." Maybe you recognize that line. It's the opening stanza of one of our most beloved hymns. This table prayer calls us to an enduring, relentless habit of thanksgiving. It calls us to understand that our suffering is indeed redemptive when we partner with God and look for God to transform that suffering into something good. It calls us into deep relationships with God and with one another. And it calls us to have a project or something in which we are focused and passionate, that serves others, that gives deep meaning to our lives. And this, then, is how we learn to rejoice and give thanks always. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.